Second session of the Anishinaabe Implementing Anishinaabe Laws Forum. Our original hope was to have some in-person dialogue for these sessions, of course, but some scheduling issues during the summer made us decide to change over to a virtual format and host them throughout the year. Our first was held in November, and we heard an amazing talk from Dr. Carrie Miller from the University of Manitoba, and that lecture is now available on our Anishinaabe Nation YouTube channel. If you missed out, we will post a link in the webinar chat. Over the course of the speaker series, we will delve into various aspects of Anishinaabe laws, exploring their historical roots, contemporary relevance, and future trajectory. We are honored to have speakers who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to these discussions. Their presentations will not only educate, but also spark thought-provoking dialogues, hopefully, and considerations of how these important Anishinaabe governance principles can be meaningfully implemented at all levels where Anishinaabe gather, not only in governance, but in education and even health. This morning, our plan is to give our guests from the Anishinaabe Nation and Grand Council Treaty 3 time to speak about the Manitowoc-Wakī Nak'nagēwin and Toolkit. And during the initial presentation, if you have questions, I ask that you write them down or send them through the chat to the host. And afterwards, we can have some dialogue where we can chat about some of their project implementation and how we might be able to use them for revitalizing Anishinaabe governance across the Anishinaabe nations. Without further ado, I pass it over to our host, our guest from Grand Council Treaty 3. Miigwech.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I guess I should start out Wawatigi Shikin Shinkaz, Kuchting and Nonji, Namando Dem. My name is Dan Morriso, and I'm a political advisor here at Grand Council Treaty Number 3. And I'd like to thank Grand Chief Niganobi for the invite. For those of you that don't know, back many moons ago, I was the political advisor at the Chiefs of Ontario. And so I believe I know a couple of you here, but over the years, I've had the great privilege, the honor and privilege of visiting many Anishinaabe Nation communities. I still have my coffee cup from Aamjiwnaang, and I've spent many summer evenings in Curve Lake. I still have my fillet knife from Rocky Bay, and I still have a bottle of turtle wax from Whitefish River. So over the past couple of years, we've been having many discussions with Grand Chief Niganobi. When he first became Grand Council Chief, he asked us very humbly to help him with certain traditional aspects of getting to know our traditional forms of governance. So of course we said, sure, we can do that. It was a little difficult over COVID, but we made it work. So today we're going to give you the brief presentation on our governance model here in Treaty 3. And after that, my colleague here, Mr. Lucas King, will provide you with some insight into Manitowoc-Wakī Nak'nagēwin, which is our Earth Law, and how we've started to implement that across the territory. So I'm trying to share my screen here. Hopefully this will work. Let's see here. How's that? All good?
Perfect.
Okay. So an introduction to Treaty 3, but very much a broad version here. So the mandates of our nation. So the mandate of Grand Council Treaty Number 3 is first and foremost to protect the future of our people by ensuring the protection, preservation, and enhancement of inherent and treaty rights. We see this goal as being advanced by the exercise of, number 1, inherent jurisdiction, 2, sovereignty, 3, nation building, and 4, traditional governance. Sometimes I joke with our staff that, you can do whatever you want so long as you can justify it in that mandate. One thing that we always try to convey here in Treaty 3 is that we're the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3. And I think of all the audiences, I think you're the most understanding of, the Anishinaabe Nation exists outside of Treaty 3. Grand Council Treaty number 3 is our national representation within the boundaries of Treaty number 3. So we recognize, of course, that the Anishinaabe Nation exists well to the east, to the west, into the United States, and north beyond Treaty number 3. So it's just, one of those little things that we try to always correct in our documents and make sure that we are the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3, not of Treaty 3. So what is the four-directional governance model? Well, we established the four-directional governance model in 2019 by the vote of the elected leadership here in the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3. It was chosen as their preferred method over 4 others that were presented by the technicians. And honestly, I was quite surprised that they chose this model, because it very much so emphasizes the national characteristics of the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3. And the others seemed to be more the status quo. So this was really a step forward. Maybe a little difficult to see, but the diagram on the right there is how we set everything up. So we keep everything in our 4 directions, of course, north, east, south, and west. And we have 4 committees: economic, social, environmental, and cultural. And basically every issue that we have can be fit into one of those 4 categories. Around the outside there, you see our 28 communities, and they're all laid out geographically. And then, of course, each direction also has representation on each of the committees, right? So it creates a nice inclusive atmosphere for leadership. So as you can see there with our map, we're very lucky in Treaty 3 in that 28 is nicely divisible by 4. So we have 7 communities in each direction, and they chose which direction they were in. Everybody seemed to be relatively happy with their geographic location. So these communities generally work together anyway. So it was a good fit. For those of you that don't know the exact geographic location, you can see Winnipeg off to the left there, and then Thunder Bay is off to the right. My community there of Couchiching, we're basically right smack dab in the middle. It's 4 hours in both directions, so we're right between the 2 cities. Our 4-directional governance model also has the constituent councils. So originally there was 4. We had the Elders Council, the Women's Council, the Men's Council, and the Youth Council. But the Ogichda saw it necessary that that there were individuals in our nation that didn't feel that they were represented by those 4 categories, and so he felt it necessary that we develop an LGBTQ 2S+ committee, which we established in relatively short order, got up and running, and so now we have 5 councils. The Elders Council is informal. We have councils, or we have elders from all across the territory in the council, and they're not selected as the others are, but the other 4 are traditionally selected by their peers along the lines of the 4 geographic regions every 4 years, along with our national selection for the position of the Ogichda. And there you can see a couple of logos that our councils have created for themselves. Again, keeping in the spirit of 4 directions, we have the 4 chiefs committees, like I mentioned: economic, social, environmental, and cultural. Off to the left there, you can see where we've placed the major issues that are facing us today. This is a working list. Of course, we have various issues that come and go over time, but they all fit within these 4 chiefs committees. And these 4 chiefs committees are made up of 7 chiefs split up across the geographic regions. On the right there, you can see the list of our chiefs and our communities. So every time that there's a selection of an Ogitchita, one direction is responsible for, sorry, I think someone went hot mic there. We have each geographic region is responsible for selecting the chair and the co-chair of a selected committee. And every 4 years, it's rotated once to the right. So right now, the North was responsible for selecting the chair and the co-chair of the Economic Committee, and the East was responsible for the Social Committee, and so on. And then what happens is that the geographic regions get into their little groups there. The 7 chiefs sit together, and they decide, okay, who do we want? So the Northern chiefs would get together, right? They've already chosen who their chair and their co-chair is. Then they have to decide who's on the Social Committee, who's on the Environmental Committee, and who's on the Cultural Committee, right? And just keep moving on to clockwise to the right until all the seats are filled. And this ensures that the geographic regions are all represented in their committees, and that no committee is dominated by one direction. So it, again, creates that national approach to things. Now, sometimes this can be too broad, so we've left it open to ad hoc chiefs committees. So chiefs can, of course, strike additional committees at any time. Usually these committees are tied to specific resolutions, to a specific goal, or are created for a specific task. So on the right here, you can see 4 ad hoc committees, the additional chiefs committees, the Bell FOTS committee, which refers to the Bell fiber optic transmission system, which was one of the reasons why we created Manitoulin-Okanagan, or wrote down parts of Manitoulin-Okanagan back in the late 90s. We have the resource revenue sharing chiefs, which oversee the implementation of our resource revenue sharing agreement. We have a treaty implementation table, and of course, we have an organizational structure. So, for example, say we have an issue with our organizational structure. Instead of going to all 28 chiefs and asking what they think, we're able to go to the 5 chiefs there that the 28 have selected to oversee that, and then they can provide recommendations back to the 28 chiefs at our assemblies. So our corporate structure, and this slide was actually specifically put in because we always get this question from Anishinaabeg leadership about, how do we move away from corporate structure? So when he was first selected in 1997, Ogitchita Kavanaugh was tasked with creating a traditional and functional form of governance. So everyone kind of looks around and says, well, what is that? And this is the question that we always get of, well, how do we reconcile corporate structures with traditional governance? And something that Ogitchita has repeatedly told me over the years is that, sometimes we struggle to integrate our traditional governance in within corporate lines. And he says, as long as who we are is at the core of everything that we do, then it will be good, right? So we have to do our best. We can't, insist on a direct division all the time, but we do our best with the guidance of the chiefs and our constituent councils to ensure that our traditional governance sits nicely alongside our corporate structure, and that again, who we are is at the core of everything that we do. So in most cases in Treaty 3, the Indian Act chiefs, and I know that some see that as a pejorative term, but it is a matter of fact that we live in this entity called Canada, and there is this thing called the Indian Act, and elections are held according to Indian Act rules. But for the most part here in Treaty 3, we have fused those Indian Act chiefs, the chiefs of the 28 First Nations, with traditional leadership. So something that's kind of unique here in Treaty 3 is that we have a Chiefs Assembly and a National Assembly. and they run concurrently whenever we have our assemblies. But I'll touch more on that later. So ultimately, the chiefs remain the decision makers, and that's for most administrative issues, right? They have to remain the decision makers because they are the legal rights holders. Even though some of us may not like that, they are. So they work alongside the constituent councils to provide that oversight and advice. So all of this work is always done with those constituent councils present. So we're always sure that in all these discussions, a woman is present, a man is present, a youth is present. Now we make sure that there's an LGBTQ2S plus person is present to provide that insight that elected leadership may not always have. So we try to make sure that at every step there's representation across the broad spectrum of the nation. So our structure is laid out here to the right. We're always sure to ensure that there's two streams, political and administrative. I'm sure that you all know that oftentimes politics and business don't mix very well. So we're very careful to make sure that our political efforts and our administrative efforts are kept very separate. The administrative matters, most things that impact the organization of Grand Council Treaty Number 3 is handled by the administrative board, and the chiefs that select the political agenda are made up of the executive, and the executive are basically the chairs of those 4 chiefs committees. So on the on the right hand side there, as you can see, the one that represents the corporation, the entity that is known as Grand Council Treaty Number 3, is the executive director, and she reports back to the representative board of directors. And then the one that represents the nation is, of course, the Ogitchida, and he takes advice from the political executive, and the chiefs provide that political oversight to both the executive and the Ogitchida. And then, of course, technicians such as myself, we carry out the work, which I believe is very much the same over there at Anishinaabeg. So the Ogitchida usually we translate it as Grand Chief, but I think in treaty it's a bit more than that. In a corporate sense, he's the leader of the organization, and quite interestingly, I found out that he is actually the sole shareholder of the entity known as Grand Council Treaty Number 3, which is, somewhat of an oddity, but it's just demonstrates that we're a bit different here. In the nationhood sense, he is the living embodiment of the nation, right? He's that guy that sort of sits aside from the elected chiefs and represents the nation as a whole. So of course, he's responsible not only to those 28 chiefs, but he's also responsible to the councils, right, that represent the people. So I'm often asked the question, why do people identify with the role of the Ogitchida? I recall several years ago when I ran for election in my own community, walking around talking to people, there was this innate sense, from people that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be politically involved. They still had that idea, that conscious idea of what the Ogitchida was, and how he represents the nation, right? And so that extends to the political question of why do communities in Treaty 3 sometimes, or I would even say often, sacrifice their own self-interest for the good of the nation? That's an open question. I'm sure many of you may have suggestions as to why that is, but I believe personally that it's evidence that the traditional governance structure was never completely destroyed. That's still represented here at Grand Council Treaty Number 3. And so I think that we're neither Indian Act nor are we corporate. I believe that we're something else. I'm not sure exactly what that is. I mean, we can talk for days about that, but I do believe that there's something else there that the average person identifies with, and our leadership is able to utilize in order to benefit our entire nation. Of course, the traditional roles of the Ogitchida are very extensive. I don't even pretend to understand what he's up to half the time. You know, the guy is always attending various ceremonies and, of course, traveling abroad, right? He's always down out to where you guys are, meeting with your elders and having these traditional governance discussions. So that beyond the core duties of Grand Council Treaty Number 3, the Ogitchida has duties that extend beyond that. So our goal here at Grand Council is to create that solid support structure that frees up the Ogitchida to attend to these duties, right? And I think we've done a really good job at that. Our political executive is always willing to step up to stand in for the Ogitchida if he has other matters that he has to attend to, and our staff do an excellent job of ensuring that everything remains relatively stable, even when leadership is away attending to other duties. So in practice, again, mentioned our assemblies. The Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3 actually have two concurrent assemblies, the Chieftain Assembly and the National Assembly. Usually our assemblies are 3 days. So we sort of split it up where the National Assembly is the first day and then the Chieftain Assembly is the second and the third day. But that can change depending on agendas and needs. All resolutions that go to our assemblies are vetted through the Chiefs Committees first. That's something that I think is relatively uncommon elsewhere. I see in many other assemblies resolutions being brought to the floor before anybody had actually had the time to look through them. And I think that's pretty crucial to a lot of our successes, that we can get the work done because people have had the opportunity to go over these resolutions. So when resolutions come in, we take a look at them and we decide, okay, which of those 4 Chiefs committees does that go into, right? So say we have a resolution on, say, mining, for example, right? That would go to environmental, obviously. Those 7 chiefs would look it over, have the discussion. And because those 7 chiefs are representative of the 4 directions, usually the geographic concerns are included in there. And then through their committee meeting, they have the discussion, propose any amendments or anything like that, goes through, they say, okay, goes to the assembly, it's voted on. And that means that usually there's not much extensive debate on it at National Assembly because the environmental chiefs have looked it over already, proposed their changes, their amendments, and so it goes through relatively easily. At each of the assemblies that we have during the National Assembly piece, the committees report back to the people and to the chiefs along with technician support. Each of the constituent councils are provided time to speak to their issues, right? So the Women's Council will get up there and speak to what the Women's Council has been up to over the past 6 months. And of course, any citizen can request to address the National Assembly. Right? Usually it doesn't happen very often, but you know, sometimes there's 2 or 3 people that request time to speak to the National Assembly on any issues that they feel are of national importance. Right? And surprisingly, as long as I've been here, it's never caused any issues. So the people love that. They have the opportunity to speak to the chiefs and speak to those around them. And you know, it's quite interesting sometimes the issues that are brought forward in that manner. However, and this is where the corporate structure comes back into things, the Chiefs and Assembly is, of course, still for the Ogimakanuk, so the chiefs under the Indian Act. And this is something that linguistically I noticed was different when I was working for the Chiefs of Ontario and working amongst the Anishinaabe leadership, is that oftentimes I hear the term Ogima or Gima used down there. Our chiefs tend to avoid that because when you add on Khan to something, it means sort of maybe not manufactured, but something that's made, right? And so that's where our chiefs are very adamant that we refer to them as the Ogimakanuk because they are the chiefs under the Indian Act, right? So our Ogimas come in many shapes and forms, but Ogimakanuk refers specifically to those Indian chiefs that represent the 28 First Nations here in Treaty 3. One of the oddities that comes from this practice of having two assemblies is that during COVID, we had to take a look at the bylaws and get some legal opinion as to whether we could hold assemblies. The legal opinion stated that the chiefs and assembly can be held virtually. In fact, you can hold it pretty much at any time, through any means, whether you could hold it through a telephone line if you wanted to. However, the National Assemblies cannot be held virtually at all because the sacred items have to be present. And this is where the National Assembly is made up not just of those 28 chiefs and not just of the citizens of the nation, but also the items, the spirits, the ancestors, right? It's all encompassing of the nation. So we have to ensure that that's open to everyone and everything, so to speak. So over the course of COVID there, it was difficult to have national assemblies. We missed a couple, but it's, again, one of those little perks that we have here in Treaty 3. And it's one of the reasons why we have to remember that there is a difference between a Chiefs Assembly and a National Assembly. So what are some of the problems that we solved? And of course, I guess I'll never say solve, we should say mitigated, with this four-directional governance model. In Treaty 3, we've always had this infamous north-south divide, and that's where, you know, the chiefs centered around Kenora and the chiefs centered around Fort Frances usually went their own way, and sort of carved out their own little interests, and the nation sometimes suffered as a result. This four-directional governance model really mitigated that divide. It split up the cafeteria cliques. So, you know, every organization, every grouping of people, it's just natural that come lunchtime, you sit with people that you know. And of course, our chiefs are no different. They did the same. And it created these little cliques, right? Where tribal councils would sit together, and regions would sit together. But now, because of this four-directional governance model, leadership are essentially forced to engage with those from all across the four directions, and it forces input from each of the four directions into each issue. So it creates a more well-rounded approach to every issue that we bring forward. It provides input from quote unquote the nation in every aspect of governance. Like I said, we have an elder at every meeting. We have somebody that's LGBTQ2S plus at every meeting, and it forces that input that maybe wouldn't always be there into every meeting. This four-directional governance model really provides that consistent, reliable oversight of Grand Council work and ensures an informed leadership. And this is really important because these committees are able to, you know, notice of a couple of days, have a meeting, you know, say something in social blows up, right? There's a health crisis or something. They're able to get together, the 7 of them, have a meeting really quickly. And then, of course, the information that's gathered at that meeting can go out with those chiefs to the four directions, and they can tell their neighbors what's going on, right? So it's a very good communication tool, and ensures that coordination across the 55,000 square miles that is Treaty 3. It replaced the old tribal council system of chiefs essentially protecting their own turf at the expense of the nation's unity. You know, of course, those issues are still there. Those political issues still come up. But this four-directional governance model definitely created an avenue for that ongoing discussion, and ensured that, you know, everyone looks through a more national lens. So is it perfect? We say no, of course, but it works for us. And this is something that Ogichita is always very cautious in that when organizations such as Anishinaabe ask us to come and provide an overview of how we do things, we're always certain that, you know, Ogichita will say, yes, we'll show you how we do it, but how you do it will ultimately be up to you. It's sort of a running joke that Treaty 3 wants to be left alone all the time. And that's because we're off here doing our own thing, right? We observe what others are doing, and then we'll take what is potentially beneficial to us and implement it into our own traditional governance system. But of course, that doesn't mean that we're not open to sharing our knowledge with others and providing advice when it's requested. We're constantly striving to find improvement. It's a living model. The LGBTQ2S Plus Council is a perfect example of this. It wasn't in the original the original model that was presented, but the chiefs saw that it was a necessity, and we put it in there within the span. I think it was up and running within a month and a half. It was so this model is very evolving in nature. Of course, some issues will remain. No model will solve all of our issues. One of the major problems that we have is many of our communities are still on the Enact's 2-year cycle of elections. So we have constant and non-uniform elections in communities. Our Ogeechobee selection and our constituent council selections are fixed at 4 years, but communities are all over the place. So our committees are always in constant flux, chiefs coming and going. But over the past couple of years, there's been some pretty good stability, and we've been able to get a lot of work done. Of course, there's always going to be that inevitable loading of responsibility onto certain committees. Some of you may have noticed that there's really only 3 issue categories under social, but those are health, childcare, and social services, which I'm sure you all know, those are huge files. So oftentimes the social committee is overloaded in its work, right? And that's something where that's sort of inevitable with the work that we do. One of the major benefits, of course, of this model is that it forces regional representation. But of course, the other downside of that is that no matter where you hold a meeting, somebody's going to have to travel, right? If we have a meeting in Winnipeg, that means that the ones that are closer to Thunder Bay, they're going to have a 6-hour drive. That's something that's just inevitable. That's going to happen. But our chiefs becoming very proficient at Zoom and telecommuting has really lessened that. So, overall, I think, again, is it perfect? No, but it seems to be working for us. And our last changeover here back in October, the chiefs only recommended very minor, slight changes to things because they've been relatively happy with how things have been going. So that's it for me. I don't know if we have any questions that have come up, but if not, let's see here. I don't see anything in the chat. So if there's no questions, then I guess I can turn it back to our moderator or over to Lucas for the MAI portion. Hey, Rich.
I don't see any questions at the moment right now either. We did say share them at the end, but I do believe we could do a couple now if we had any. Oh, I see Dave Shawana with his hand up and down. There we go. Here it comes.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just trying to get my screen to show my face as well, but unfortunately, I'm not sure why it's not doing it. But likewise, big much for providing an overview of the structure. First of all, maybe as you can see on the screen, my name is Dave Shauna, but my Anishinaabe name is Wialkaden in addition to cause, and I'm a citizen of Serpent River, Orkanabeji First Nation. I hold a role here with the Anishinaabe Nation as the the Restoration of Jurisdiction Director. And we've been working over the years as a department mandated by the Chiefs and Assembly to speak to or help move a principle around Anishinaabe governance. And so we've actually been successful in a couple of self-government approaches, be it our governance and as well as our education. So they're both recognized by Canada now as laws, I guess, that they're acts of government. So we're quite pleased with that. So I appreciate how you noted some issues and noted some of the development and things there's evolution that obviously things need to change accordingly. So one question I have is I see there is a lot of as we refer to in the Anishinaabe territory here, Gima or Gimakwe. There's lots of work with respects to the leadership and making decisions to help resolve and deal with issues and move forward. I just wondering, how are the citizens inclusive of these types of decisions and amendments? And ultimately, I would imagine likewise our leadership, our representative, our 65,000 citizens of the Anishinaabe territory. So just want to know how are the citizens or the Atabendazajik involved in some of that evolutionary change? Ingrid.
Yeah, so excellent question. I won't paint a rosy picture of Treaty 3. We have these representative issues like everybody does across Canada, right? We are living within the Indian Act system, but our constituent councils, I think, have gone a long way to providing the citizens' input into ongoing processes, and to a similar degree, the ability of citizens to engage at our national assemblies, right? Anybody, whether it's a 4-year-old or the Ogichita himself, he can get up and speak to an issue that they find is important during national assemblies, right? And I find that oftentimes people just want to be heard, right? That's all that it is, and that's why I say that oftentimes our national assemblies, our so-called open mic moments, it doesn't create a lot of controversy. It's just people providing opinions and providing advice to chiefs on the floor. Right? But yeah, in terms of, it's because the constituent councils are selected directly from the people, and this is where we do the traditional stand-up selection for them as well. We're able to have citizens from across the territory, all 28 communities, come together should they choose, and have those discussions. What are the issues facing men? What are the issues facing the elders? What are the issues facing youth? And then those that are selected through that process, they're the ones that sit at the table with the chiefs, and they're always the ones at the table there saying, well, remember, this impacts youth in this way, and this impacts LGBT individuals in this way. And so I think since we've established this new model, again, it's not that everything's perfect. It's not that people still don't feel that their voice isn't being heard, but we've again mitigated a lot of those concerns. So for what's our population now? 40,000 people, right? Each one of them has an opportunity, should they so choose, to participate in selecting their constituent councils or attend national assemblies and have their gripes. So yeah, I hope that somewhat answered your question.
No, good question.
I see a question here. Explain the Ogamakan. Yeah, so it's just one of those little linguistic things. And so whenever you tack on con to something, it's like you made it, right? It's like don't know if synthetic is the right word, but it's, and this is where some people sort of use the pejorative of fake chief. I don't think it means fake chief. It just means that it's a leadership position that was created, and created by what? Well, the Indian Act. Right. So our 28 chiefs, they're all selected. You know, some of them have community codes and don't follow the Indian Act exactly, but still, you know, as the 28 so-called rights holders in Treaty 3, they are the Ogemakan. And that separates them apart from, well, what is an Ogima? In our, you know, language or our dialect here in Treaty 3, it means one that leads, right? Or one that sets the direction. And so there's Ogimas that you know, are out there that are not Ogima Kanag, right? Not every Ogima is an Indian Act chief. Right? So it's just that little linguistic thing that I noticed it when I came to work at the Chiefs of Ontario, because we very rarely actually use the term Ogima in any of our business here in Treaty 3, because the chiefs themselves are and our elders are very adamant in saying that, oh no, they're Ogima Kanag, they're in that position that was made. So yeah, it's something that I always found interesting.
Dan, there's one more question in the panelist chat there too for you.
I don't see it.
The question is, when reviewing resolutions at the Chiefs Committee level, does it proceed if all regions are not represented at the committee meeting?
Okay. When reviewing. Well, so it's essentially quorum, right? Of course, not all chiefs will be present at all Chiefs Committee meetings. Sometimes they send proxies. I think for the most part, because there's only 7 chiefs on each committee, it's a very rare instance that there's less than 5 of them there. So it's actually quite a rare instance that the directions aren't included in every committee meeting. Recently, since again the pandemic, there's been a lot of telecommuting. So I don't know. I think Lucas can vouch for this, that his Chiefs Committee there, I think usually most regions are represented. All the regions are represented.
Yeah, we have a great commitment from our Chiefs committees, and we always make sure, like, if someone isn't there, there's a follow-up phone call or a document sent over to. So we always make sure that if 1 or 2, regardless of the region, like representative, isn't there, we have a follow-up. But most oftentimes, there's a proxy or we run a hybrid meeting as well.
And of course, every chief is given their binder, right? So the resolutions are in there, and if they notice anything that's, you know, glaring, of course they'll bring it up. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Dan. I don't see any other questions.
Awesome.
Thank you much.
Great, so we'll hop right into our presentation on Manitoua Key and Okanagan, and a big part of implementation of Manitoua Key and Okanagan is exactly what Dan was talking about in terms of our 4-direction governance model. So can everyone see the screen all right? I'm gonna assume yes.
If you can
Just, like, make
enlarge it or
it
put it in
full screen.
presentation mode.
Yeah,
Okay, let's give this a go. How's that?
perfect.
Awesome. All right, so good morning, everyone. My name's Lucas King. I'm the director of the Territorial Planning Unit at Grand Council Treaty 3. Our unit deals with most everything environmental and reports to the Environmental Chiefs Committee that Dan mentioned earlier. So there's a few of us here today to chat about Manitowoc and Okanagan, and really our mandate is implementation of Manitowoc and Okanagan and protection of the land and water across the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3. So I'll pass it off to Lindsay and Shai.
How buro kiweden no Indishnakas makoan dodem wabgoni zagaigan Anishinaabe and Donchi. My name's Lindsay Bain. I'm from Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation. I am also serving as the regulatory manager in the territorial planning unit. So basically making sure that like any development in the territory is compliant to our laws and working through and drafting up formal implementation processes in the department. Shai, do you want to do a quick intro and then we can
Yeah, I
jump
was
into
gonna do after you. Hi, Buju, Asinkanu, Indishnakas, Piju, and Dodem, Nisatchuan, Dunji. My name is Shai. I'm from Nisatchuan Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3, and I'm a policy analyst working with Lindsay and Lucas, and yeah.
Miigwech. So if you want to go to the next slide, Lucas, thanks. What is Manitowoc and Okanagan? At the beginning of time, Sagama Manitou gave the Anishinaabe duties and responsibilities to protect, care for, and respect the land. These duties were to last forever in spirit and breath and all of life for all of eternity. Anishinaabe and Okanagan has governed relations with Mother Earth since time immemorial. Today, the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3 continues to live by Anishinaabe and Okanagan. The authoritative versions of these laws are mostly oral. They're held in ceremony and learned from the animals, plants, the sun, changes in the season. Anishinaabe and Okanagan coexist with Western law as it predates man-made laws. In Treaty 3, one of those Anishinaabe laws is Manitowoc and Okanagan. It's written within and throughout nature. It is our Great Earth and Resource Law. It extends to the center of the earth, all beings and its inhabitants, to the sky and throughout the entire universe. The spirit and intent of Manitowoc and Okanagan signifies the duty to respect and protect lands that may be affected from overuse, degradation, and unethical processes. Lessons from Creator and elders have taught us that Manitowoc and Okanagan is a manner of thought, a way of life, and a way of living Minoba Matswin, or a good life.
So
MAI
just going
sorry.
off with what Lindsay was saying, I was talking to an elder, I think last summer, an engagement session, and he was like, do you guys want to know like what MAI is? And then I was like, yeah, obviously, sure. And he was like, my dad told me to like look outside, like look at the land, look at the skies, look at the water, look at the animals, look at the humans. Like that is Manitowoc and Okanagan. And that is our way. Sorry, I haven't talked today. And that is our way of life. So just chiming in like what Lindsay was saying, like all of that is inherent of who we are as Anishinaabe, and it's been with us since the beginning of time. And everything that we live is not just, and I get a bit confused using the word law because there is no word for law in our language, as you guys probably know too. It's just what the Creator gave us to follow if we choose to, in order to live, as Lindsay was saying, Minoba Matswin, like in the good way. And we could honestly go on and on about MAI like for hours and hours and hours. So this is like the very simple gist of what it is. But yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, so it's inherent law to the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3 since time immemorial. It governs our relationships with the lands and its inhabitants throughout daily life, including respecting the lands and waters, providing offerings to the spirits and Creator when you benefit from Mother Earth's gifts, such as through fishing, hunting, or transportation, knowing your rights as a Treaty 3 member, understanding the responsibility as a caretaker of the land. When a project adheres to Manitowoc-Key Anoknagewin, ceremony is a foundational aspect to that process. It's important that the project goes through ceremony because the original spirit and intent of the law lies within ceremony. Manitowoc-Key Anoknagewin sets the framework for economic development, protection of the environment, creating economies, building partnerships, and revenue sharing. Not sure if there was anything else you wanted to add, Shai or Lucas. Otherwise, we can shift to the next one. Thanks. Yeah, Manitowoc-Key Anoknagewin was, oh, sorry.
Oh, I can do this one. So it's
Sure.
kind of like touched on the fact where I was talking about how when you look at the land, it's unwritten Manitowoc-Key Anoknagewin. It's a spiritual and natural law, and it's that feeling of and a way of life of being Anishinaabe. So obviously you can't write all of that into a document. So when Bell Canada came to Treaty 3 in 1997 and wanted to put a fiber optics line throughout the territory, we were like, okay, we need somehow a process that our laws can be seen as valid or give authority to the Western world in order to be to protect our land and waters. So we went through, I think it was a 4-day ceremony on Powell Island in all the directions. We went through sweat lodges, talked to elders, and we ended up, the spirits and ancestors said that it was okay to write a portion of the law down on paper in order for us to, what's that word? Push our laws forward with the Western world. So we do have it written in on paper, and yeah, Lindsay, you can chime in.
No, it's just having regulatory legitimacy or
Oh yeah,
is unless it's written down on paper in English, then provincial and federal governments basically have said we don't have laws since we can't physically prove them, even though that's not how we've been an oral society.
yeah. And something that Dan Moroso actually said, he was saying you know how treaties have authoritative versions in their own specific languages? Our authoritative version would be the oral version, the land that is the unwritten part, which is truly the real law. But yeah, and it's all, I don't know, Lindsay, you can go. And so written was a means of harmonization with the Western systems. Yeah.
Yeah, the law itself is ecocentric, meaning it considers and acknowledges not just human beings that live on this land, but all things on Earth possess a spirit and life. It's based on not only on rights, but on responsibilities that we have as a collective to care for Mother Earth. It's guided by communities in Treaty 3 and supports the collective rights of the nation as a whole while affirming jurisdiction of Anishinaabe laws, as Shai was just reiterating. It's helped to provide a lawmaking process and is centered on the inherent relationship to creation. Although the law itself was given to the Anishinaabe at the beginning of time, it's important to understand that the responsibility to protect and respect creation doesn't solely depend on Anishinaabe people, but it's a collective duty of all of us to protect all of creation. I think next slide, unless there's anything else you wanted to add.
So the significance of MAI, well, it's huge. It's the law of the nation. It's what we use for every single project. It's how we live in our way of life. But just talking about, sorry, I haven't done a presentation in a while. But it is the foundation for harmonized nation-to-nation relationships. And as Lindsay was saying, the whole purpose, or can't think of words, is for the protection of the environment. And it does have the structure for its decision making, and at the end of the day, it upholds nationhood. Lucas, do you want to kind of chime in on this one?
Sure. I would just add in around being that guiding. I mean, Shai, I think you said it really well in terms of law, not necessarily being that word, right? But in Okanagan, in that do's and don'ts and guiding that relationship with the land and water, right? So as Dan touched on, our 4-direction governance model talks about economic, social, cultural, and environmental, and how do we have those pillars that are in the governance model of the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3 be supported in decision making around land and water, right? And feed all of that together, and ensuring in that nationhood piece we're respecting the jurisdiction of the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3 as a collective, but as well the individual jurisdiction of each of the 28 Treaty 3 communities too. So it's a process of decision making in relation to the land and water and that development, but a means to be able to harmonize jurisdictions between Western and Anishinaabe processes, but then also within the Anishinaabe Nation and Treaty 3 itself too. Let me head to the next slide.
So within Manitoulin Okanagan, there are 4 principles that guide our work with a project. And so there are 4 principles here. So the first one is wewene, which translates to English, taking your time. So it literally means take your time. Like there's no rush to push projects fast without taking the meaningful time to invoke guidance from our lodges, our ancestors, our spirit helpers, and the land. And that's done through songs, through ceremonies. Yeah, but it just really means like just don't rush. Like there's no rush for anything. The next one is bebeka, which is doing it right. So this one basically means just making sure that relationship building occurs at every stage there is. So whether it be a political forum, a technical level, a task force, there will be appropriate levels of authority built, and the education of public, government, and industry to promote harmonization and respect is done throughout. Lindsay, do you want to do the last 2?
Sure. So yeah, listen to, as Dan had kind of reiterated, councils are an important part of our traditional governance model and decision-making processes. So you have to make sure that you listen to not only councils, but all of our people in our nation, and have that be representative of like elders, men, women, youth, 2S, LGBTQIA+, as well as like people with disabilities, just to make sure that like all voices are heard and perspectives are represented, and any decisions are really in the best interest of all people in the nation. And our last one's don't be afraid. So don't be afraid of implementing our laws and principles. We have inherent in treaty rights, and we have jurisdiction to have that be implemented and enforced. And yeah, just don't be afraid to stand up for your rights, basically. From a nationhood level, it's don't be afraid to stand by our laws and ways of life and respecting that, because we have that responsibility for time immemorial. Do you want to cover the rest of the slide, Shai, or I don't know, what else did we have on this one?
Sure. So when these principles are used, it really sets the tone for a meaningful traditional and contemporary consultation. So as a means to really harmonize efficiently with our laws and the Western laws. Of course, it minimizes negative environmental effects. It does invoke process funding, and it outlines responsibilities of the Crown, proponent, and Treaty 3. So overall, we are really looking for a joint process that will ultimately activate spiritual guidance throughout the entire project and just harmonize, not integrate or incorporate, harmonize.
Good to go to the next slide.
Sure.
And I think that that really sets us up well, Shai, because I know we oftentimes have that conversation with Western regulators, and they're like, okay, let's do this. We'll do it together. Just come participate in our model, right? And that's not the direction that we receive in the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3. And everyone here today has talked about that traditional form of governance. So one on the right-hand side, again, you see that 4-direction governance model being a core to everything in terms of implementation. But in terms of governance and regulation of Manitowoc and Okanagan, it's really important right off the get-go to state, right, this is not a Canadian duty to consult process. It's not, it may guide a creation of, say, a consultation protocol right within one of those systems, but it is not a duty to consult process. That's, a Western process, but it is an application of inherent jurisdiction. It provokes traditional governance through Anishinaabe ceremony and guidance and the 4-direction governance model. And it leads to authorization by the nation so that no process can ignore one community or disrespect, the manners or methods of the community and the nations to decide on a project, right? And again, core to that is all of those pillars to decision making that have been discussed throughout the presentation. So another key piece, and we've touched on in terms of harmonization, is the process itself doesn't displace a Treaty 3 community's jurisdiction and process, but rather supplements and complements it. So an example of that is 1997 in terms of the Belfast case. The line ran through 7 communities, and those 7 communities were engaged in that duty to consult process. So when it came to that time, the leadership of one of the communities stood up and said, and this goes back to the principle of don't be afraid as well too, stood up and said, okay, we can't say yes to this unless the entire nation is on board, because this is also crossing the entirety of that shared territory in Treaty 3. So when we talk about implementation of Manitowoc and Okanagan, there's an internal portion and then there's a harmonized external portion too that speaks to that treaty and that shared responsibility to the land. So speaking of that, this is a process from a process diagram from Elder Fred Kelly from Onigaming First Nation, who many of you may know as a governance expert. But this is, the basis of our implementation is around that harmonization and that respect for the separate jurisdictions that are held as the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3, Treaty 3 communities, and then also respecting the jurisdiction of Western systems as well too. So it's about ultimately that harmonization of the administration of jurisdiction. So respecting those processes that all need to go through in order to come to their decision and recommendations. And once those recommendations are seen, how to ultimately, from a nation to nation perspective, do we come to a final decision? And that, as we go through Manitowoc and Okanagan, you'll see there's that harmonization process internal to the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3 as well too. So this would be a slide that we show when we talk about any laws in the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3, specifically when we have conversations with Western regulators and governments as well too. So the phases of Manitowoc-Key and Okanagan, there's 4 phases plus, as you'll see, kind of a bit of a life cycle phase as a 4+1 model. The visioning phase is where everything starts. It's that conversation of, you know, what's the goal? What's the information that's needed in order to move forward? What's the decision? Who are the decision makers? What's their process in decision making? What are the ceremonial protocols? And developing that shared understanding of, you know, the purpose, priorities, responsibilities. And this phase is really important too, because it also outlines, you know, if you do have a proponent entering the territory, right, what are their responsibilities in adhering to Manitowoc-Key and Okanagan for their specific project. Once that visioning phase is complete, we head into the scouting phase of the project. So this is where past, present, and future generations are considered. All the factors are taken into account and explored. So oftentimes we talk about environmental assessment or impact assessment. As we talk about Manitowoc-Key and Okanagan, scouting phase would be where, you know, your evaluation of a project occurs, right? All that data and information is gathered. There's an engagement of the nation through the 4-direction governance model and engagement of all the relations through ceremonial protocol as well too. The hunter, warrior, gatherer phase, exactly as it says, you've gathered all that information to one place. So all those plans and projects have been committed to, and everything's kind of brought together. And those recommendations from that point are made to move forward. So once you've gotten to the feasting and celebrating phase, you know, a recommendation has come to, and our knowledge keepers often talk about conditional consent. So you see in the next slide, we'll go to the contemporary process, but we speak to a lot of conditional consent throughout a lifespan of a project. So in that feasting and celebrating phase of Manitowoc-Key and Okanagan, you would get to that initial construction conditional consent to move forward, or there'd be a feasting and celebrating of that decision that this project isn't moving forward, or whatever the recommendation of the nation may be. So in terms of the contemporary implementation, I think it's really important as we've gone through this presentation that we talk about in Okanagan and Onokanagan, and as Shai and Lindsay talked about that written and unwritten. And so when we talk about the unwritten law, that is what's guiding the relationship to the land and water in Treaty 3. And, you know, as Dan said earlier, right, there's a constant, you know, keeping the core of who we are at everything we do. And that's making, regardless of the harmonization process we may have to undertake with the Western system, we keep that core the same. So in that light, right, what we're talking about today in terms of those 4 phases and this contemporary process isn't necessarily in Okanagan. It's Onokanagan, which is that regulatory process. And in the territorial planning unit, our mandate is, of course, asserting that regulatory process and supporting Treaty 3 communities in asserting their Onokanagan as well too, and their regulatory process for deciding on projects. So that's really our mandate, is opening up that space. And there's the Onokanagan, which is the umbrella for the nation as a whole, and each of the Treaty 3 communities and a nation process all have that regulatory process that gets harmonized across the board. So In the contemporary process talked about, that first aspect is relationship building, right? This is very early in the life cycle of our project. If we're getting into examples, it's the development of appropriate relationships, a shared understanding of the process, Manitowoc and Okanagan education, discuss goals and develop an approach. So the way we like to talk to proponents about it when we do Manitowoc and Okanagan education, which is something we commonly do with proponents in Treaty 3, is, as the proponent, you have a responsibility, and that responsibility is to understand the place that you're in and where you're proposing work. So in this case, right, you have to, in Treaty 3, you have to understand the jurisdiction and the laws that are within the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3 and Treaty 3 territory. And you may also have to understand the jurisdiction of Ontario or Canada or Manitoba, depending on where in Treaty 3 your project may be. So it's then in that early relationship building, there's conversations that are had between, quote unquote, regulators, which would be the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3, Treaty 3 communities, Ontario, Manitoba, Canada, on, what does that decision-making process look like between the jurisdictions. So once we hit the application phase, this is where those 4 phases of Manitowoc and Okanagan are really triggered in that visioning phase. So an application of a project comes to the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3, and a discussion then from that trigger is held in terms of the location of the project, who needs to decide, who's involved in the decision making, and we hear our other political advisor, Gary Allen, talk about it most often, right? Everyone's in terms of a shared territory until they've said that they're out. There isn't a proximity model or a delegation. It's a discussion until those communities decide and that leadership decides who's in and out in terms of the decision making and what that process looks like. So that all occurs once an application is put into the nation and that visioning phase is triggered. So once that application comes in and those decisions are made, and part of that internal harmonization that we mentioned earlier is that, so when we talk about one of our current projects that we have going on is development of a Treaty 3 project assessment. So that's a nation-based process of environmental assessment or impact assessment, whatever you want to call it. And that would be, internal to the nation, and, a GCT3 potentially led process. But the highway twinning process is a really important conversation to share, how harmonization is done within the Anishinaabe Nation Treaty 3. And in that case, right, Grand Council itself wasn't necessarily hands-on involved in the harmonized impact assessment, but 4 communities took the lead, or 5 communities took the lead. 4 worked together and 1 abided by its own individual processes to evaluate highway twinning in the western portion of the Treaty 3 territory. And there was a communication protocol back to the nation as a whole in terms of that authorization of the project. So depending on the project that comes in, it can be individual communities that take the lead in terms of evaluation and are reporting back to the nation as a whole at those assemblies. Or it can be a nation-led process, or it can be multiple of those going on at the same time. And ultimately, once we get into that authorization phase, those recommendations from those processes are all heard, and that consensus is derived to provide that conditional consent. So in that evaluation phase, that's part of the scouting and the hunter-gatherer phase. At Grand Council, that's the Treaty 3 project assessment in each of, and the Manitowoc and Okanagan authorization process. So that's that Own Okanagan to Manitowoc and Okanagan. And then that's the community resource laws and protocols for deciding on a project. The authorization phase is when all the recommendations come together from the nation as a whole and the community processes, and those are discussed for decision making. And in that authorization phase, you move to the feasting and celebrating, and that's where the ratification and the celebration of that decision happens. So you won't ever see in this model, right, the nation come out and say, this is our position, and, you know, 7 different communities going, well, we have the opposite. It's an internal governance model where that conversation happens, and there's consensus derived. And of course, there's always going to be differing opinions, right? But it's building that space for those recommendations, those processes to take place in order to come together as a nation as a whole and provide that consent for a project to go forward or to not go forward. And really, as we build this out, the whole point around, one, asserting the jurisdiction of the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3, but also providing a framework to proponents and Western governments for entering into Treaty 3 territory. Oftentimes we start, you know, I like to say we start on like step -5 because a proponent enters the territory and they're maybe a quarter, a third of the way through a Western regulatory process, and they go, this is our project, this is our project plan, you know, this is the budget we have for our project. And, you know, that conversation ensues from not a good place, because how do you legitimately put comments or provide feedback or decide on a project when you haven't been involved from the onset? So it's really important that this provides regulatory clarity to proponents and governments when they enter into Treaty 3, and so that when a project is being planned, they can actually have this in the relationship building phase, you know, have this conversation early, understand what their roles and responsibilities are going to be in the territory, and then that battle will be more mitigated anyways in terms of, you know, the budget to undertake evaluation, how the decision's made, and how do we get to that point of either project go or no go place. So as we talk about conditional consent, that last phase is around compliance and monitoring, really understanding the entire life cycle of a project. Obviously compliance to Manitowoc and Okanagan, but to the recommendations and protocols that were set for that conditional consent. Conditional consent happens at different phases. We have, you know, construction phase, the operation phase, and then closure. So each of these is authorized by the nations on the condition that are found through Manitowoc and Okanagan, and there is an approach and a common understanding that would be agreed to between proponents and the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3 in terms of if these regulations aren't met at each of those conditional consent points. So if there's an employment quota that's put in, right, as a regulation for a project, right, and that isn't met, you know, 5-6 years down the road, then there's a trigger for that conditional consent to be operating in Treaty 3 to be revoked. Or maybe an impact benefit agreement, right, needs to be reached prior to construction, so that conditional consent isn't granted until that impact benefit agreement, you know, is taking place. And then working on a government to government front, in the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3, we have a resource revenue sharing agreement and that model. And so depending on the project coming in, right, ensuring that nation to nation or government to government revenue is being shared from the benefits that are derived from the shared territory that is Treaty 3. So those are the 5 contemporary phases of Manitowoc and Okanagan, or the Manitowoc and Okanagan authorization process. And the really important piece there too is that harmonization between communities and the nation as a whole in that shared territory, and the aspect of conditional consent. That consent itself isn't static, it's a process ongoing throughout time. So just as we wrap up, just wanted to share the quote on the screen. We've done a lot of work, and I will acknowledge Shai here in the work that she's done with our team at Grant Council in putting together the Manitowoc Okanagan Toolkit. And one of our other staff, Haley Krolick, as well, spent a lot of time working with elders and community members, doing the historical research to bring together a Manitowoc Okanagan Toolkit. And it's a really important resource in terms of the education for not only internally in the nation, but externally. And that was the mandate that was received by the chiefs in assembly as well too. So as we continue to implement, that toolkit provides that written piece to share for folks for that knowledge gaining and education. So this is one of the quotes that came in that process of interviewing membership, and really the important piece here, right? Sharing it with 7 generations. And another really important quote that we don't ever own the land, that we borrow the land from the future generations, and it's our job to protect that for them for the future as well too. And in Treaty 3, Manitowoc Okanagan is that guiding force to be able to do so. So just wanted to share a number of our resources. We can share these links as well out, but always just, come visit our Territorial Planning Unit website. You'll find resources on our Treaty 3 NEB declaration, the Manitowoc Okanagan Toolkit, and a bunch of other things that we're working in terms of asserting that jurisdiction and the operationalization of Manitowoc Okanagan. And as we all know, it's a work in progress. It's a living model, and but slowly but surely moving that bar forward in terms of having that nation-to-nation relationship that is the spirit and intent of Treaty 3. So thank you, and we can jump into some questions.
I do see the one question in the Q&A is there was one, if any issues with conduct.
Dan, do you want this, or do you want me to jump in on that one?
Oh yeah, I answered that one by text. Basically, if you're referring to community leadership, that would be a matter internal to communities to go through their own processes, and Grand Council would adhere to whatever decisions the community makes regarding their leadership. If you're referring to Ogitchida, then the Ogitchida or Ogitchida has to sign their oath of office and a code of conduct. And so, luckily, so far, there hasn't been any breaches of that. So what would happen if they were found in breach of that? Well, I guess the chiefs as the electors would decide. So.
Yeah, I think that code of conduct is really important too, because everyone internal and signed contractors, external, and things like that, right, are all signed on to that code of conduct, and it's also present at all the assemblies and chiefs meetings as well too. The next question I see on the Q&A is, I'm interested in the words for Mother Earth. I was under the understanding that there was no concept in Anishinaabe-Moan as this recently constructed. Maybe you can pass to, is Gary in the room over there, Dan, or what?
No, he's in another meeting. Yeah, it's an interesting idea, right? I guess I've heard some discussions about that sort of thing. I mean, it's translating Anishinaabe is difficult on a good day. So trying to discuss whether or not there's a direct or even indirect translation of Mother Earth. I would say direct translation, not that I've heard, but the concept is there, right? And so this is where, like, I mean, if you really want to get like really philosophical about it, right? Because we're dealing with a genderless language, right? There's no gendered Anishinaabe dialect out there that I know of. It even comes into like, you know, what is the creator, right? Is it an entity? Like, is it a person? Is it like, is that the concept of it being personified actually influenced by colonialism, right? Where there's a god that looks at you, or is creator like the personification of creation, right? And is that related to the concept of like all of our relations and that sort of thing? I'm probably not the person to be asking, but it is a very interesting idea to ask. And when you think about it, it really impacts the way that you look at things like this, right? And this is, as Lucas said, sometimes getting industry or newcomers to the point where they can understand Manitoaki Nakanigawen involves breaking down concepts like this, right? Where their concept of us may actually be Mother Earth, like sort of hippie dream catcher kind of people, right? But there's a lot more to us than that, and we're a lot more nuanced. So, but yeah, it's a very good question. I don't know how to answer that.
I see the next question on the Q&A here is the process that Lucas and team have been presenting on, contemporary process, is it consistent with other priorities areas for Grand Council Treaty 3, i.e. education, economic development, etc.? So I would say yes. So the process that we're talking about in terms of Manitowoc and Okanagan, like the contemporary process, is triggered with any impact to the land, right? So we're currently undergoing what's called the Demajimoan Fiber Project. There's currently, a twinning project in the territory, ongoing mining. So anytime that there is an impact to the land, right, that Manitowoc and Okanagan process is triggered and needs to be respected. Even if those projects, right, are say you're building a hospital, right? Obviously, that is in line with the health priorities, but that actual build itself and that impact to the land to build the physical infrastructure, right, is guided through a Manitowoc and Okanagan process. And in that process, considerations are held in terms of the economic development, the environmental protections, the social impacts, and the cultural pieces as well too. So across those 4 pillars that Dan talked about in terms of the 4-direction governance models and all of those portfolio areas that are in that, all are part of Manitowoc and Okanagan decision-making process. So when we talk about the contemporary process, we're ensuring that all those 4 pillars are part of it, and that we're applying the 4-direction governance model to make sure all the voices also that need to be heard are part of that process as well too.
Yeah, I think I would add that, like, in terms of, its connection to the other priority areas, this is only one of the laws, right? There's other laws that are currently in development. I think this one was the most difficult one because it was the first one that we actually wrote down and operationalized. The other ones are coming more quickly now. But I think this sort of gets back to what Shai said earlier, that an Okanagan, like we translate an Okanagan to mean law, right? Because we're lazy, and that's like the Western world understands what a law is, right? But an Okanagan is like it's like a way of knowing, right? It's a way of knowing what is right and what your obligations are in order to live that good life that we always talk about, right? And so there's, again, as the presenters were saying, there's written and there's unwritten Manitowoc and Okanagan. And beyond that, there's also like that, it's two different layers of law, right? So if any of you have ever heard Fred Kelly speak, he'll talk about the 4 levels of Anishinaabe law, right? You got your Kaga Kewe, which is like creator's law, which is embedded in like the most sacred aspects of creation, and like even if you had access to it, I don't think that mere mortals would understand it. Right? That's for creator to implement. Then there's Kete Inokanagewan, which is like your customary laws, or not customary, but your ancestral law, and that's what's held in our ceremonies and our songs and our pipes and our items and stuff like that, right? Our eagle staffs, and those are things that sort of guide overall, our processes, and that's why we do ceremony, right? To get access to that guidance. But Manitowoc and Okanagan is the 3rd level down, and that's where it's an Anishinaabe and Okanagan. And there's all different kinds of Anishinaabe and Okanagan, right? It's customary laws. It's how society governs itself, how individuals govern themselves, how they know what they're doing is right. But then there's also like the 4th level down, which is Ojibwe and Okanagan, and Ojibwe basically means writing. So it's anything that's written down. So that's where communities can write policies, and they can, your HR policy, that's Ojibwe and Okanagan, right? And that can be anything. But each level has to be responsible to the level above. And that's where, like Ogichida always says, when we're developing things like MAI, we're only scraping enough off the surface in order to give it to the visitors, to the government, so that they can understand what the concept is, right? Because you're never going to be able to convey the actual customary law in a manner that does it justice. Like the written version of Manitowoc and Okanagan is what, 6.5 pages. There's not a lot there to work with. But it's just enough to understand what the concept is. The rest is held in those songs, in those traditions, in those community processes. And so this is where it's important to remember that individual communities retain their autonomy, and they can implement these laws however they see fit. And I think I see some leadership in the room here. I think that's the one thing that we really treasure, that we learned, is that you have to maintain the community autonomy, because it can't be seen as, like, as soon as you say the word law, right, you get the idea that somebody's coming to your house and telling you what to do. That's not what it is. The law is just, you're not going to get one. It's just informing you how to lead that good life. And that's what makes, like, Abenuchi and Okanagan, our childcare law, or our upcoming healthcare law, even possible. Because, as a policy analyst, when I first started learning about these things, I thought, oh, there's no way that you're going to go to communities and tell them how to run their child welfare. The agencies are going to fight back. But then as the communities and the agencies learn more that, this is just the guiding principles, the customary laws, that, it's very easy to adhere to them, because we're all Anishinaabe, right? So it's all innate in us that this is what should be done. And then the difficulty is then writing your Ojibwe and Okanagan in a manner that's consistent with that, right? And that allows communities to implement MAI or their child welfare legislation in a way that's unique to them, and it allows them to use their best practices in order to come into compliance with the national law. So, and that's where people all across the country are quite amazed, especially at our child welfare law. I mean, Wapsimung got their jurisdiction back in the span of 2 days. It's just mind-blowing. But that's because they used Abenuchi and Okanagan, along with their own customary codes in the communities, to integrate right in there with Bill C-92. And the feds looked it over and said, yep, everything checks out. You guys are running your own show. Here you go. Right? So it's very interesting to see this process in action. And again, if you're impressed by MAI, just wait until we get the other ones up and running, because those are going to solve problems that MAI can't even dream of. So I just wanted to add that. Miigwech.
Thanks, Dan. And I just see two other questions in the panel question there. So one being how long was this whole process, and the other one being how do they assert the law, and does the Western law assist or resist it? I mean, to answer the how long is this process, or was this process? It's an ongoing living process. I think, you know, Shai can attest to probably a couple of years of work on the Manitowoc Keenan toolkit. There's elders in leadership that have lived the implementation and operationalization of Manitowoc Keenan for their whole lives. But essentially over the past 5 for sure in the TPU, we've been working on this as an authorization process. And as Dan said, you know, that regulation and policy piece. So we're currently building a applications portal for proponents and governments to be applying to the nation. We have finalized our Treaty 3 GeoPortal, which is like the data center to house all that public information, but also all that internal community data as well. One of the big pieces we continually work on is our Treaty 3 project assessment process. And then we have work going on still in community-based monitoring and building Treaty 3 stewardship officers across the territory too, in line with other Guardians programs to make sure that we have that compliance. So the process building is ongoing. We have some amazing steps that have been completed, but tying them all together is something that continues to be ongoing. And then, yeah, how is the assertion of the law done and assisting or resisting? If you, I think, sit down and have a conversation with our leadership, you know, how do you assert the law? The answer often comes back to us with the environmental chiefs of just do it. And no, we are not sponsored by Nike for that as well. But yeah, the answer is constantly of we just have to do it. And that goes back to the principles of don't be afraid as well, right? How do we actually, like, how do we implement that? We take a multiple track approach. A big piece of that is education. To make sure there's an understanding, right? Because you start to then build that like external public trust as well too, and an understanding of what that process looks like, what the law is that way. And then for governments and proponents from a Western sense, we take a multiple track approach of that relationship building with governments and building that government to government piece. And what does the jurisdictional harmonization look like? And then we work with proponents on their education and responsibilities and then have agreements that way too. So the more regulatory certainty that we provide to proponents, right? We work on a willingness model of them being able to and willing to work with us. And that oftentimes then it continues to influence the landscape of development in Treaty 3 as well. So there is obviously the ultimate goal, right? That every project is governed by Manitowoc Keenan, but we're in a process right now of understanding the historical resource development, the current, and what is the future, right? And making sure that all of those projects are guided by Manitowoc Keenan. So there's distance, but there's also a lot of willingness to work together and find different approaches and be creative to harmonization of the jurisdictions as well.
Yeah, and I think that as time goes on, the more that we do this, the more easy it is to assert the law and the less resistance we encounter. Because both proponents and governments are starting to realize, like, oh, hey, if we just go through this process, you know, everybody's happy at the end of the day. And this is where, like, we mentioned the Four Winds, right? Those 4 communities, they didn't have to technically go through MAI, right? They could have just said, this is our own project. It only affects us, right? We're carving out our IBAs and we're done. But they didn't, right? Because they went through the nation's process, and it gave them a lot of power, because then the government was dealing not with just 4 communities, but 28, you know. And similarly, right, Wabigoon could have taken their most affected community status and run with it. But instead, they went, well, we have our own process, but there's also this national process, right? So again, regardless of how that process goes, you either have 28 supporting you or you have 28 very loud opponents to it. And I think that's where industry, especially if they're looking to mitigate risk, you know, companies become very used to having one First Nation spout off, but having 28 come at you, that's a different matter entirely. So like, again, as time marches on, it's becoming increasingly difficult for governments and industry to ignore our laws, because you just, like Lucas said, what Chief Kovanes and Chief Arnold there used to say, and just do it. Don't worry about what they're doing, just do it. And it's working out for us.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. So I just want to say thanks for everyone to listening to us. And yeah, if there is any additional questions, feel free anytime to reach out to our team, and we're happy to meet with anyone anytime. So
Oh, I was wondering if that was the Lila. That's funny. Lila's from Couchiching. We're from the same reserve. It's like, is that Lila? Yeah, it's Lila.
Well, I guess that will adjourn it for today. Just as you had predicted, I had a schedule. But thank you very much for your time.